The first of two videos today will be on the electromagnetic spectrum. The electromagnetic spectrum is light. Now, when I say light, I mean that in the broad sense of all the different kinds of light, not just the visible light that you see with your eyes. You're probably already familiar with hearing some of these terms like radio waves, X-rays, microwaves, infrared, ultraviolet, gamma. So we will talk about each one of these categories in a little bit. But beforehand, the first thing I want to talk about is how this scale works. If you look at the top, you see the wavelengths, and the wavelength starts at about 3 million meters and goes to 300, 3 centimeters, gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And it gets smaller and smaller as we move from radio to gamma. The frequency gets higher, starting at about 1 all the way up to 10 to the 24th. Now, this scale is logarithmic in nature. So if you look at this scale, it looks like at first, the radio wave, how much it encompasses versus some of the other components. It's a little bit tricky in that sense because you would think, oh, this looks like it's about half of the spectrum. But the truth is 10 to the 12th compared to 10 to the 24th is virtually nothing. So what do I mean by a log scale? It's actually easier to take a look at something that we are a little bit more familiar with, like the United States national debt. So this is the year, and this is the debt. Now, this is a log scale based graph. Notice my y-axis goes 1, 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, then into the millions, the billions, and then the trillions. So each step, instead of being stepped up by 1, is stepped up by a power of 10. Now we'll start with 1850 at 63 million, so we're between 10 million and 100 million. 1900 at 2 billion, so we'll go just above the 1 billion mark. 1950, we go to 250 billion, so above the 100 billion, but below 1 trillion. And then at 2000, we're just above the 1 trillion mark. If you were to present this graph and say, behold, the US national debt, a lot of people would sit there and say, oh, it's linear in nature. They might say something like, yeah, every single president has gone ahead and since, 1850 increased our national debt, but they're doing it pretty consistently. Are they though? Because this is a log-based scale where the y-axis is a power of 10. If we go to a standard-based scale where each step is by 1 or by 1 trillion or whatever it happens to be, this is the graph that we actually get. 1850, that's at 63 million, which my y-axis I've scaled in the trillions. 1 trillion, 2 trillion, 3 trillion, 4, 5, 6 trillion. That's what E12 is. So 65 million looks like it's pretty darn close to zero. 2 billion still looks like it's pretty darn close to zero. 250 billion, barely up over the zero mark. And then we get to 2000 and we're at 5.67 trillion. Now, this suddenly looks very exponential, and indeed it is. The same thing happens with the electromagnetic spectrum when we say that it's a logarithmic scale in nature. So, one of the things I do want to point out once again is as we move from radio to gamma, and we will go radio, the ones we'll focus on this class, so we'll talk about microwaves, but for the most part, we're going to kind of consider microwaves as a cross of somewhere between the radio and infrared. So we'll look at radio, then we'll look at infrared, visible, UV, X-ray, gamma ray, Greek letter for gamma. As I move this way, I go into shorter wavelengths, higher frequencies, and therefore higher energy levels. Another thing I want to point out by just looking visibly at the spectrum is how small the visible light spectrum actually is. Compared to the full spectrum, visible light makes up a tiny, tiny fraction of the light that actually does exist. So the light that we see is very small compared to all the light in general. Let's talk more deeply about these particular categories of light. This image, by the way, is from your textbook, which you can find online through WebAssign. So radio, often known as TV waves too, their uses are pretty straightforward. Believe it or not, they're used for communication. Communication, remote controls, although infrared is also used for remote controls as well. There's all kinds of different radio waves. You have you have FM radio and AM radio are perfect examples. But for the most part, your communications, whether it be a radio station, a television, a cell phone, a walkie-talkie, they're going to be using radio waves. Microwaves is often considered just a part of the infrared and radio spectrum where the two kind of cross over. Microwaves became very important for us because, well, the invention of the microwave. Obviously, microwave is used to heat food. It heats food through the process known as resonance. We talked about resonance earlier in this unit. What happens is the microwave's frequency happens to match the natural frequency of the water molecule as it vibrates. So as the microwave strikes the water molecule, it causes it to resonate and therefore heat up. Other uses of microwaves, you'll find radar guns are an excellent use of microwaves. Infrared waves, this is often called thermal radiation, and that is incorrect. Although it is fair to say the overwhelming majority of hot objects emit more infrared radiation. So stars, for example, emit a tremendous amount of infrared radiation. Your old school light bulbs, not the LEDs, but the old school ones, the ones where if you try and change the light bulb after it just burned out for running for a few hours, will burn your hand. Those are actually giving off more infrared radiation than they are visible radiation. Infrared radiation can be used to track heat and also trap heat. So we see one of the issues of infrared radiation is the greenhouse effect. It can also be used for thermal imaging. Do not confuse thermal imaging with night vision. Night vision actually uses visible light and it amplifies the visible light that it receives. So imagine, night vision on a nighttime raid. You still have a little bit of light from the moon and from the stars. It's not 100% dark. What the night vision goggles will do is they'll take that small quantity of visible light that they receive and they amplify it an extreme amount. And that's how night vision goggles work. Thermal vision is completely different. Thermal vision, thermal imaging is using infrared radiation. As I said, it often gets misnamed as being thermal radiation, that is incorrect. But there is some truth to it. For example, a human being versus a tree. A human being is a warm-blooded animal. The tree is going to tend to take the temperature level of whatever the outside atmosphere is. So what thermal imaging will do is if you have a human being standing next to a tree at nighttime and you take a thermal image of it, the human being is going to appear a lot more brighter than the tree because the human being, which is giving off heat, is giving off more infrared radiation. The next level is visible light. Visible light is, well, believe it or not, that's what you see with your eyes. Visible light, we do know Roy G. Biv, the 7 colors in visible light: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. I just want to go ahead and say that there's more than 7 colors. There's a lot more than 7 colors. There's arguably an infinite amount of colors in the visible light. What about something that's in between red and orange? Is there any color you could think of? Of course you can. Are there all kinds of different shades of blue? Well, duh. So it's not just blue and there's one blue and that's it. That's not true. I mean, just look at here. Here's a blue. Here's another blue. And here's another blue. Those are 3 different blues, but they're all blue in some way. We wouldn't categorize them as one color. We would categorize them as 3 different colors. Uses for visible light. If I have to tell you what the use for visible light is, I'm a little afraid. Ultraviolet. or known as UV. Ultraviolet is produced naturally by the sun. Ultraviolet is filtered out in our atmosphere by the ozone layer. Part of the theory of evolution describes life beginning in water as opposed to in air, because without the ozone layer, the sun's ultraviolet radiation will kill organisms on the surface of the planet. That includes us. That's why in the summertime, if you stand in the sun for too long, you're going to get sunburned. That sunburn is caused by ultraviolet radiation. The ozone layer filters out quite a bit of the ultraviolet radiation, so it would be even worse without the ozone layer. Now, so how does this come to life beginning in water? Well, because water can filter out ultraviolet radiation as well, and it does it much more effectively than our atmosphere. Over time, some of the organisms in water begin respiration, which means that, not respiration. What they do is they begin converting carbon dioxide into oxygen through photosynthesis. And in doing so, they create oxygen in the atmosphere and the development of the ozone layer, which can now protect ultraviolet radiation from the sun, and therefore life can move on to land. Ultraviolet radiation does have usefulness to it, though. As you see here, vitamin D production is important. Without ultraviolet radiation, it won't work. That's why you can't just use a standard light bulb in your house to help with a vitamin D deficiency. You have to use a specialized light that will give off some ultraviolet radiation. Black lights are another example. Different bodily fluids do end up giving off a fluorescent glow when exposed to ultraviolet radiation. If you go to some kind of party or event where there are black lights, do not be afraid in terms of the ultraviolet radiation is going to cause cancer. Those particular black lights are so low level ultraviolet that they're effectively harmless. Our last two in the spectrum are X-rays and gamma rays. X-rays are the highest level of light that comes from electrons. Obviously, some things that emit X-rays are an X-ray machine, and probably the number one use you've been thinking of is taking an X-ray for medical diagnosis. The issue with X-rays is that they can cause cancer over time. That's why when you get an X-ray at the dentist office, while you are positioned to have the X-ray taken of you, the dentist tends to walk out of the room, because if they were constantly exposed to that many X-rays, they would develop cancer. Should you worry? No, because you're getting your teeth X-rayed once a year, you're fine. That dentist could be doing 10 or 12 X-rays in a given day, and doing that a given day for 200 to 250 work days a year, that's not good. So the X-ray radiation, also another old use, not so much anymore, is the old school televisions, TV tubes. Those used a small X-ray emitting machine. Does the sun emit X-rays? Yes, it emits a lot of X-rays. We can also use it too for sterilization, because X-rays are deadly to living tissue. So along with using sanitation products to clean medical equipment, you can also bombard them with X-rays to kill off any microbes that might still be on the medical instruments. Gamma radiation is by far the most unique of these, because gamma radiation is the only form of radiation that does not come from an electron. All of these, radio through X-ray, are emitted via electrons. Gamma rays are not. They are emitted from the nucleus of the atom. They are evident in nuclear decay. That's why elements like uranium, we can't have a block of uranium-235 just hanging out in the classroom for us to pass around. Not because of the coronavirus, but because the U-235 is emitting gamma rays, and that is deadly to you. That will cause cancer. Most certainly, you could also end up getting radiation sickness. Radiation sickness occurs because the actual gamma ray just breaks apart your DNA. And as the cells go to replicate, they can't replicate correctly because they're missing part of the DNA for the replication process. Of course, that makes gamma rays a usefulness in terms of cancer therapy, as well as medical sanitation for the same reason X-rays. But for cancer, what makes it particularly unique is gamma rays are going to kill everything that they hit. Okay, they are like tiny bullets that destroy all living things. Cancer is technically living tissue. It is bad tissue. It's tissue that, as the cell went ahead and replicated, it did it incorrectly. And but it is still, in a sense, a living tissue. So what the gamma ray can do is it can kill it. A good example is using gamma radiation or nuclear therapy for brain cancer, because chemotherapy can't actually help you with brain cancer, at least not as of today, as I'm publishing this, uh, because that's the way chemotherapy works. Is it won't target the cancer in brain cells. Gamma radiation will, though. So our technique is, since we can't really focus gamma radiation very well, is to build a cast to put on your head and then bombard it with gamma rays, in particular, leaving the parts with the cancerous cells exposed. Gamma radiation obviously comes from nuclear reactors. That's why the control room has to be, kept under a lot of close security and control. If you have something like Chernobyl, some of that radiation is going to leak out and just go into our atmosphere. That is not good. Um, Bombs, nuclear weapons, obviously, to give off gamma radiation. The sun gives off a tremendous amount of gamma radiation. Both gamma radiation and X rays are emitted from the sun, but fortunately, our atmosphere protects us from them. Otherwise, we would all basically be suffering from this. All right, that's a wrap on the electromagnetic spectrum. I'll continue on with energy levels in the next video.